When a government authority declared it was turning a notoriously ruthless apex predator loose into the wetlands to halt an invasive nightmare, the public dismissed it as a fever dream. It read like an internet hoax, a ridiculous story cooked up to farm clicks online. But then, across the vast expanses of the floodplain, an eerie silence settled over the reeds. Mangled python carcasses began floating down the drainage canals. Crushed nesting mounds were discovered, stripped of their eggs. Something fast, aggressive, and completely unyielding was moving through the dark backwaters at night. The station hands, trappers, and locals who worked these waterways knew instantly what was out there, even while official channels maintained absolute silence. I'm Ambrose Wield, and this is one of the most extraordinary ecological gambits ever whispered about in the bush. Because the punchline everyone laughed at was suddenly leaving a trail of destruction across the landscape. For over 2 decades, the fight against the introduced python had ceased to be a management program. It was a slow, crushing war of attrition. These floodplains were once among the loudest, most vibrant ecological corridors in the country. But by the mid-2000s, long before the scientists formally documented it, the locals noticed the land going quiet. Fewer wallabies grazing the tracks at dusk. Fewer possums along the tree lines. A landmark survey published a decade later finally quantified that dead quiet. Native mammal sightings had collapsed by over 90% across the core affected zones. In the worst-hit sectors, native quolls and bandicoots couldn't be found by researchers at all. That is the devastating reality most accounts gloss over. The pythons hadn't just reduced native wildlife. Across millions of hectares, they had virtually erased entire populations. How does a single introduced reptile conquer an entire biome? Silently, and with our unwitting assistance. Decades prior, exotic reptiles were imported as novelties. Once they grew too large and dangerous for suburban backyards, overwhelmed owners quietly turned them loose into the scrub. Then, a catastrophic tropical cyclone flattened a specialized breeding facility on the fringe of the wetlands, scattering dozens of surviving snakes straight into prime habitat. They adapted with terrifying speed. A single female can lay scores of eggs and store genetic material for seasons to come. What began as a handful of escaped pets morphed into a self-sustaining army operating in a landscape with zero natural predators to keep them in check. Faced with an unprecedented ecological collapse, land management agencies deployed every conventional weapon in the modern biosecurity arsenal. They introduced lucrative bounty systems, paying licensed professional trappers per meter of snake brought in. They trained scent-tracking dogs to navigate the razor-sharp sawgrass and thick mud. They deployed the Judas strategy, tagging captured males with radio transmitters to lead rangers straight to dense seasonal breeding aggregations hidden in the bush. Teams spent thousands of hours wading through waist-deep, leech-infested waters, supported by thermal imaging drones and specialized traps. Every tactic scored short-term victories, only to hit the exact same impenetrable geographic barrier. The regional wetland system spans over 6,000 square kilometers of swamp, paperbark forests, and flooded black soil plains, most of it entirely inaccessible by vehicle or on foot. A python's cryptic camouflage is so refined that seasoned hunters have routinely walked right over 4-meter specimens without ever spotting them. After 20 years of relentless effort, the total number of snakes culled represented barely a drop in the ocean compared to the true, sprawling population. In a landscape that vast, you simply cannot win a war of eradication when you are locating only one enemy soldier out of every 20. By the late 2000s and 10s, sheer desperation was spawning ideas that sounded like absolute madness. Human trappers weren't enough. Mechanical solutions had failed. And that was when someone, half joking at a biosecurity conference, voiced the one radical concept that refused to die. What if we deploy a natural biological control that actively hunts them down? Enter Mellivora capensis, the honey badger. To the casual observer familiar only with internet clips, it is a creature defined by pure, unhinged tenacity. But behind that viral reputation lies an evolutionary masterpiece, purpose-built for lethal subterranean combat. Its hide is extraordinarily thick and rubbery, attached so loosely to its muscular frame that if a massive predator seizes it in its jaws, the badger can physically turn around inside its own skin to bite directly back into its attacker's face. Its physiology possesses a natural biochemical tolerance to heavy neurotoxins and hemotoxins, allowing it to withstand severe venomous strikes, slip into a temporary metabolic coma, and wake up hours later to finish eating the very snake that bit it. In its native African territories, it routinely targets heavy constrictors and highly venomous serpents by preference. An experienced wildlife handler once summarized the animal's temperament perfectly. You don't train a creature like this, you negotiate with it, and you usually lose. This is the precise point where official history diverges sharply from what was actually unfolding out on the ground. Publicly, the official stance from primary industries and environmental departments remained totally immovable. There were no honey badgers in the country, period. But out along the remote flood channels and pastoral station boundaries, the field reports were piling up into an undeniable mountain of evidence. Airboat operators and feral animal contractors began discovering large python remains shredded into jagged fragments, rather than swallowed whole. A brutal, high-energy killing method foreign to any native top predator. Station hands photographed deep, five-toed claw prints pressed into the sticky, drying mud along creek beds, tracks that matched absolutely nothing on the official National Biodiversity Database. Then, an automated motion sensor trail camera, mounted in a remote timber block, captured a fleeting, grainy clip. A low-slung, heavily muscled, pale-backed animal dragging a massive reptile through the shallows. Before it paused, stared directly into the infrared lens with cold indifference, and vanished into the darkness. The internet seized on the clip instantly, dubbing the phantom creature the Outback badger. But online rumors don't alter the functional mechanics of a damaged ecosystem. Hard numbers do. Around the exact same time these sightings spiked, contract snake catchers operating in long-term monitoring zones noticed a sudden, chilling shift in the landscape. Across several targeted breeding hotspots, active python nesting mounds dropped by nearly a third in a single wet season. Egg clutches that would normally have hatched hundreds of aggressive hatchlings were being found violently torn open, dug out from deep earth, and abandoned. One veteran field biologist described it as the country taking its very first deep breath after holding it for 20 years. And then came the psychological shift that no native predator had ever managed to induce. The apex snake started acting visibly skittish. That behavioral shift matters far more than simple mortality figures, because a control agent doesn't need to slaughter every single pest to completely overturn the status quo. Ecologists refer to this dynamic as the landscape of fear, one of the most potent forces shaping wild habitats on Earth. When top-tier carnivores are reintroduced to an environment, they rarely kill every herbivore or competitor. Instead, their terrifying presence forces target species out of prime feeding grounds and forces them to change their movement patterns. If an aggressive hunter was actively targeting these massive constrictors in the thick scrub, it wasn't going to succeed merely through body count. It was going to win by making the entire river system feel lethally dangerous to a predator that had spent 2 decades without a single reason to look over its shoulder. Gradually, vague rural rumors coalesced into a specific, persistent theory, detailing a covert trial known off the record as Operation Badger. The cold operational logic behind it resembled a calculated game of ecological chess. If the invasive constrictor had dismantled every conventional human eradication tool by operating as a silent, invisible ambush killer in dense cover, the ultimate countermeasure was not sending more weary hunters into the heat. It was deploying an animal that habitually ambushes the ambusher. The leaked specifications of the alleged trial described an intensely controlled, small-scale experiment. This was never a massive, indiscriminate release of hundreds of wild beasts. It was a targeted trial involving a few dozen microchipped, radio-collared specimens quietly liberated into isolated, high-density snake hotspots under tight scientific research permits. The entire strategic gamble hinged on the badger's own fierce biological traits to act as a natural containment fence. They are intensely solitary creatures that refuse to form packs or colonies, with single males fiercely patrolling and defending huge home ranges against their own kind. In theory, that relentless territoriality would prevent uncontrolled population explosions. In theory. Because beneath the captivating narrative lies an uncomfortable, historic reality that makes every biosecurity officer break out in a cold sweat. This exact hubris is precisely how the continent's worst ecological catastrophes were born. Australia has walked down this dark path before, with disastrous consequences. In the 1930s, agricultural authorities enthusiastically released the Central American cane toad into northern sugar plantations to devour destructive cane beetles. The toad completely ignored the beetles, multiplied exponentially across millions of square kilometers, and began poisoning every native predator, quoll, and crocodile that attempted to ingest it. Critics of Operation Badger immediately raised the obvious nightmare scenario. What happens when these introduced badgers finish off the local python clusters and turn their lethal attention to our endangered echidnas, ground-nesting bushstone curlews, or bilbies? The pragmatic defenders of the program offered a grim, uncompromising rebuttal. Do nothing, and there will be no native bushland left to protect anyway. Left unchecked, there is only the snake. Then, an anonymous online leak transformed the academic debate into an explosive political crisis. On a regional landcare forum, an unknown user uploaded what appeared to be internal government memos detailing real-time tracking coordinates, specific release grids, and predation mortality metrics. Initial skeptics labeled the documents an elaborate hoax, right up until a high-resolution photograph surfaced alongside the text. The image showed a heavy-set badger wearing a tight satellite telemetry collar, standing triumphantly over the dead, mangled coils of a 3-meter python. That single photograph stripped away all remaining comedy. Investigative journalists began pressing state departments, and the story that emerged was not a cartoonish release of dangerous vermin. It was a cold, highly calculated experiment designed with a sophisticated biological objective. The goal was never total eradication of every snake across the continent. That was impossible. The objective was systemic disruption, breaking up breeding aggregations, destroying egg clutches before they hatched, and instilling constant behavioral fear in a species that had reigned supreme without a predator for decades. If the leaked field data was authentic, the ecological ripple effect was already propagating across the catchment, mirroring classic trophic recovery models. Within monitored experimental zones, python nesting success plummeted year on year. Aerial drone surveys allegedly filmed badgers actively excavating snake egg mounds and hunting down juvenile constrictors, a relentless pressure no native species had ever exerted. And then, the long-absent native animals began to make their miraculous return. Native water rats and bush-tailed opossums were spotted along levees and creek banks that had been totally devoid of life for a generation. Wallabies and bandicoots began venturing back out into open paddocks and timber margins. Waterbird colonies whose nests had been systematically raided by giant snakes every dry season began breeding successfully again, filling the paperbark swamps with the deafening din of thousands of hungry chicks. It wasn't a complete cure, but for the first time in 20 years, the ecological trajectory had inverted. Yet the badgers did something that simultaneously thrilled field scientists and terrified biosecurity managers. They adapted to the terrain far too well. Instead of roaming vast, dry, open territories as they do across the African continent, the trial animals reportedly condensed their ranges, following watercourses and dense riverine vegetation. They shifted to a strictly nocturnal hunting pattern to avoid the blistering daytime heat and human activity, targeting giant reptiles in the cool darkness. They proved adept at avoiding human contact entirely, while systematically executing their prey, which sounded like the dream scenario, until you remember what high-level adaptability truly signifies. An animal intelligent enough to completely rewrite its behavioral routines for a new landscape is an animal you can no longer control or predict. That dangerous adaptability is precisely the same attribute observers once noted when the first python vanished into the reeds. Behind closed doors at state environmental headquarters, the official posture reportedly hardened into complete silence. Rangers and field staff were instructed to record strictly native fauna in public logs. Media inquiries were met with standard non-committal statements. A leaked internal directive summarized the strategy in 4 cold words: continue monitoring, zero external disclosure. In plain English, under no circumstances let the public know this is real. Yet by then, the official wall of silence no longer read like a denial. It read like an admission of guilt. Meanwhile, online campaigns demanding the protection and expansion of the Badger program gained widespread traction across social media platforms. But beneath the memes and pop culture references, a fierce, fundamental debate erupted among the scientists and land managers who dedicate their lives to environmental conservation. That philosophical divide is what makes this story so critical. Leading invasion biologists publicly condemned the introduction of a non-native apex predator into a sensitive ecosystem as the absolute antithesis of responsible conservation. That scathing critique is impossible to dismiss, because the modern history of acclimatization societies and biocontrol interventions is littered with catastrophic failures. The small Asian mongoose brought to Caribbean islands to control rat populations in sugar fields promptly ignored the rodents and slaughtered native bird species to near extinction. The introduction of the invasive Nile perch into East Africa's largest freshwater lake wiped out hundreds of endemic fish species found nowhere else on Earth. Every single one of those ecological disasters began as a brilliant, highly praised solution put forward by supremely confident experts. But the opposing camp fielded an argument just as devastatingly persuasive. The python crisis had raged unchecked for a full generation, and the bush was dying while authorities followed every slow, approved bureaucratic protocol. At least, defenders argued, someone had the raw audacity to throw a wrench into the works and deploy something the invaders had never encountered. You cannot reason with an invasive apex predator. You have to break it. The debate quickly escalated beyond regional forums into demands for parliamentary inquiries, speculative reports about private billionaire funding, and endless satellite mapping of remote river basins. What kept the story alive wasn't a single silver bullet leak, but an undeniable physical trend. Fewer giant snakes, recovered nesting mounds, and native life returning to the floodplains. And a network of government departments that had suddenly, suspiciously, gone completely tight-lipped. That leaves us facing a heavy question that grows more uncomfortable the longer you examine it. Because this saga was never really just about snakes or badgers. It was about our role in managing the natural world. When we have already damaged an ecosystem far beyond its capacity to self-repair, how far are we permitted to go to reverse the damage? Some look at what unfolded in those remote wetlands and see a brave, revolutionary leap forward in invasive management. Others see terrifying human arrogance, mankind reaching back into a fragile environment to rewrite the rules once again, gambling that we won't make the catastrophe infinitely worse. Perhaps what transpired out in the heat was reckless folly. Or perhaps it proved that when an ecosystem is pushed to the absolute brink of total collapse, it takes a violent, unexpected shock to jumpstart it back to life. Either way, the wetlands are no longer silent. Somewhere out there in the oppressive humidity, hidden beneath the dense paperbarks, the story is still playing out. And the natural world doesn't always wait around for human permission to fight back. I'm Ambrose Wield. If the hidden, relentless mechanics of the wild keep you awake at night the way they do me, hit subscribe and join us. Because we go searching for these untold stories every week. And the bush has plenty more secrets left to reveal.